Chapter 1. Whispers of Disease. Luke leaned on his hoe, watching as a thick fog rolled over the fields of Mousillon, creeping low over the land, as though it had a mind of its own. He shivered, pulling his cloak tighter around his shoulders. Fog wasn't unusual in these parts. Mousillon was cursed, after all, or so everyone said. But this fog felt different, almost alive, as if it held something more than just damp air and chill. He glanced toward the other villagers working nearby, his gaze lingering on old Gerard, who had collapsed just days ago, his face ashen, eyes sunk deep into his skull. Word was that Gerard had caught a fever unlike any they'd ever seen, a sickness that clung to him, hollowing him out. The healer had tried to help, but even she seemed at a loss. And now, Gerard lay in his hovel, gasping for breath, while the rest of the village whispered of a curse. Luke turned back to the soil, digging into the earth with renewed vigor, as if he could bury his unease along with the seeds he planted. His father had taught him that hard work was the only way to fend off the darkness that haunted Mousillon, but lately, it seemed even that might not be enough. By midday, his back ached and his hands were sore, but he felt he'd done his part to stave off the gnawing fear that had crept into his bones. As he made his way toward the well, he overheard snippets of conversation drifting from a group of villagers gathered nearby. "Did you hear about Martine?" one woman whispered, her voice low and anxious. "She's taken ill, same as Gerard." Another one, an older man, muttered, shaking his head. "It's spreading faster than any plague I've seen." Luke's chest tightened. First Gerard and now Martine. The healer had called it a fever, but Luke wasn't so sure. He'd seen fevers before, and none of them made people's skin turn as pale as milk, nor left them coughing up dark, thick phlegm. And it wasn't just the sickness, it was the smell that came with it, a foul, earthy stench, like rotting meat left too long in the sun. He moved closer to the group, hoping to glean more from their conversation. "How long before it reaches us all?" someone muttered, voicing the fear that Luke could see written on everyone's faces. Before anyone could respond, Armand, a wiry, sharp-eyed man, spat on the ground. "Bah, it's just another plague. We've survived worse. Mousillon's always been cursed. This isn't anything new." Luke wanted to believe him, to brush off the unease gnawing at him. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He remembered hearing strange sounds at night, scratching, rustling, like the chittering of creatures just beyond his line of sight. At first he dismissed it as rats, or maybe foxes scavenging for food, but now, with the sickness spreading, he wasn't so sure. That evening, Luke walked back to his family's small cottage, his head buzzing with what he'd heard. The fog had grown thicker, hanging in the air like a damp shroud, muffling even the faintest sounds. As he passed the edge of his family's fields, he noticed something strange, a small, dark hole in the ground, no larger than a badger's den. He stopped, leaning in to get a closer look. The hole was deep, and he could see claw marks around its entrance, as if something had been burrowing up from below. A foul odor wafted from the depths, thick and rancid, making his stomach twist. He stepped back, feeling a prickle of unease creep up his spine. "What's that?" a voice called out behind him, startling him. He turned to see his younger brother, Mark, watching him with wide eyes. "Nothing," Luke replied quickly, though his voice sounded strained even to his own ears. "Probably just a foxhole or something." But Mark didn't seem convinced. He wrinkled his nose, sniffing the air. "Smells like something died in there," he muttered, casting a wary glance at the hole. "Should we tell Father?" Luke hesitated. Part of him wanted to brush it off, to pretend it was nothing, just an animal's burrow. But another part, the part that had been awake at night, listening to those strange sounds, knew that whatever lay beneath Mousillon was no ordinary animal. "Maybe," he replied at last, his voice low, "but not yet. Let's keep an eye on it, see if anything changes." Mark gave a reluctant nod, and the two of them headed back to the cottage, the scent of rot clinging to their clothes like a bad omen. That night, Luke lay awake, staring at the wooden beams of the ceiling, his mind racing. The sickness, the burrows, the whispers in the village, it all felt connected, though he couldn't explain how. And then there were his dreams, strange and vivid, filled with dark, skittering shapes and the faint echo of a voice whispering a name he couldn't quite grasp. As the hours passed, his unease grew, twisting in his gut like a knot. He finally drifted into a restless sleep, his dreams filled with visions of darkness closing in around him, of clawed hands reaching up from the earth to drag him down. In the early hours before dawn, he awoke with a start, a single word lingering in his mind: Skrivax. The name sent a chill through him, though he didn't know why. He'd never heard it before, and yet it felt familiar, as if it were a part of him, a shadow lurking just beyond his thoughts. He lay in bed, his heart pounding, the silence of the night pressing in on him like a weight. The next day he returned to the village, hoping to find some explanation, some reason to dismiss the fears gnawing at him. But what he saw only deepened his dread. More villagers had fallen ill, their faces pale, their eyes haunted. A few were coughing up thick, dark phlegm that stained their lips and clothes, the stench of rot clinging to them. The healer moved from one patient to the next, her face drawn and grim, her usual remedies seeming to have no effect. Luke watched her work, feeling a surge of helplessness. He wasn't a healer, wasn't even someone the village looked to for answers. But he couldn't ignore the signs, couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking beneath the surface of Mousillon, something that had begun to stir, to rise. That evening, he returned to the burrow he'd found, his heart pounding as he crouched beside it, peering into the darkness. The foul smell was stronger now, and he could see faint scratches along the edge of the hole, as if something had clawed its way through the earth. He reached out, touching the dirt around the entrance, feeling the chill seep into his skin, and as he knelt there, he thought he heard it, a faint, distant chittering, like the sound of claws scraping against stone, echoing up from the depths. Luke pulled back, his heart racing, his mind a whirlwind of fear and suspicion. He couldn't ignore it any longer. There was something beneath Mousillon, something that moved in the shadows, spreading sickness and fear. And though he didn't know what it was, he knew one thing for certain: it wasn't done yet. As he rose to his feet, a strange resolve settled over him. He didn't know what he could do, didn't know how he could fight something he couldn't even see, but he knew he had to try. For his family, for the village, and for whatever piece of himself still clung to hope. With one last glance at the burrow, Luke turned and headed back toward the village, his mind set, his heart heavy with the weight of the unknown. The whispers of disease had begun, but he knew they were only the beginning. Chapter 2. The Hidden Burrows. Luke leaned against the worn wooden post at the edge of his family's field, his gaze fixed on the dark line of the forest beyond. The dawn sky was barely lightening, and a faint mist clung to the ground, weaving through the rows of crops like thin, ghostly fingers. But Luke's attention wasn't on the morning chill or the fog. His eyes kept drifting back to the burrow he'd found yesterday, a small, dark hole nestled between the roots of an ancient oak. The memory of that rank smell and the faint scratches at the entrance gnawed at him, filling him with a sense of dread he couldn't shake. Something wasn't right in Mousillon, and he had the feeling that whatever sickness had gripped his neighbors was somehow connected to what lay beneath their feet. His younger brother Mark sidled up beside him, casting an uneasy glance at the burrow. "You really think it's just a foxhole?" he asked, though his voice betrayed his doubt. Luke shook his head, keeping his voice low. "I don't know what it is, Mark, but something about it doesn't feel natural." Mark shivered, pulling his threadbare cloak tighter around his shoulders. "Do you think it's like a tunnel?" He paused, glancing at Luke. "I mean, could there be more of them?" Luke didn't answer. Instead, he squatted by the burrow, eyeing the faint claw marks around its edge. They were sharp, distinct, unlike anything he'd ever seen from an animal. He reached out, touching the earth lightly, and felt a strange chill seep into his fingertips. Without thinking, he whispered, "There might be more." Mark's eyes widened, his face pale. "What should we do? Tell Father?" Luke shook his head. Their father would only brush it off, likely muttering something about superstition and dark fancies. "No," he said quietly. "Let's keep this to ourselves for now. I want to find out what's going on before we start panicking anyone." Mark swallowed but nodded, his face set with a determination that belied his youth. They moved on, searching the field in silence, their eyes sharp for any sign of disturbance. As they walked, Luke's mind raced, piecing together fragments of conversations he'd overheard in the village, people speaking in hushed voices about sickness, about strange sounds in the night, about the unshakable feeling of being watched. They found another burrow at the far end of the field, partially concealed beneath a tangle of brambles. Luke crouched beside it, holding his breath as he examined the entrance. It looked much like the first, too large for a fox, too small for anything human. And there it was again, that smell stronger now, like wet rot and decay. "Luke," Mark whispered, his voice tight. "What if it's not an animal? What if something's digging these?" Luke couldn't bring himself to answer. He could feel it, too. That creeping sensation that whatever had made these burrows was neither fox nor badger, nor any creature they were familiar with. It was something else, something that didn't belong here. He stood, brushing the dirt from his hands. "Let's check near the village. Maybe there's more around." Mark hesitated, glancing back at the burrow. Do you think it's connected to what's making people sick?" Luke didn't respond, but the question echoed in his mind. The sickness, the burrows, the strange sounds in the night, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't quite fit together. But he knew one thing for sure. The answer lay beneath their feet, in the shadowy, twisting tunnels that burrowed through the earth. They walked back toward the village, keeping to the hedgerows and ditches, their eyes scanning the ground for any sign of disturbance. As they neared the edge of Mousillon, Luke spotted another burrow, partially hidden beneath a cluster of rocks. This one was larger, with thick clawed marks raked into the soil around its entrance, as if something had struggled to widen it. He knelt, squinting into the darkness. The stench of rot was overpowering here, and he had to force himself not to gag as he leaned closer. Just as he was about to turn away, he thought he saw something glint in the depths of the burrow, a faint, eerie green light, like the sickly glow of decayed moss. Luke's heart skipped a beat. He pulled back sharply, his pulse racing. That light, it felt wrong, unnatural, as though it were a warning from whatever lay below. "What did you see?" Mark asked, his voice hushed. "Nothing," Luke lied, his voice tight. Just more of that smell." But the memory of that glow lingered in his mind, filling him with a fear he couldn't explain. He knew that light wasn't a trick of the eye. It had been real, a faint, ghostly shimmer in the darkness, like a distant lantern guiding him deeper into the unknown. As they moved through the village, they noticed others standing by their doors, peering out at the fog-drenched morning with hollow, wary eyes. Luke heard murmurs of concern, mentions of more sick villagers, and whispered talk of curses. Even Father Emile, the village priest, stood at the chapel steps, his face pale and drawn, offering words of comfort to the frightened townsfolk. "Have faith," he intoned, his voice quavering. "This illness is but a test from the lady. We must remain strong." Luke felt a flicker of anger rise within him. It was easy for Father Emile to speak of faith when he didn't have to live with the stench of sickness, the weight of unanswered questions pressing on his chest. The people needed answers, and faith wasn't going to cure them of whatever sickness was devouring their village. They passed by old Martine's cottage, where the sound of labored coughing drifted through the thin walls. The sound was hoarse, rattling, as if each breath clawed its way from her lungs. Luke felt a pang of guilt as he listened, knowing that he had no power to help her, that all he had were suspicions and half-formed fears. "Luke," Mark whispered, breaking him from his thoughts. "What are we going to do?" Luke took a deep breath, steadying himself. "We keep looking. There's got to be a way to get deeper into those tunnels, to find whatever's down there, and stop it." Mark's eyes widened. "You want to go into the burrows?" "Luke, are you mad?" "Maybe," Luke admitted, his voice barely audible. "But if we don't, then whatever's down there will keep spreading. It's already gotten to Gerard, to Martine, and if we don't act, it'll get to us too. Mark looked away, his jaw tight, but he nodded, determination hardening his expression. All right, I'll help. Together they continued their search, moving quietly through the village, noting each burrow they found. By midday they had counted 7, each one larger than the last, the soil around them scarred with deep claw marks and soaked with that same foul stench. Luke couldn't shake the feeling that they were getting closer to something, that each burrow was a piece of a path leading them toward the heart of the sickness. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the village, Luke and Mark returned home, their minds weighed down by what they had seen. They had found no answers, only more questions, and with each step, the fear in Luke's chest grew, filling him with a gnawing sense of urgency. That night, as Luke lay in bed, he stared at the ceiling, his mind racing with images of clawed marks and the sickly green glow he had glimpsed in the burrow. He tried to sleep, but his mind wouldn't rest, and as the hours slipped by, he felt a strange compulsion building within him, a need to understand, to delve deeper into the earth and uncover whatever lurked beneath Mousillon. When he finally drifted into sleep, his dreams were filled with dark, twisting tunnels and the faint echo of a voice, low and insistent, whispering a name he couldn't quite hear. Chapter 3. Nightmares in Mousillon. Luke bolted upright in bed, his heart racing, his skin slick with sweat. The room was dark, the faint light of dawn just beginning to creep through the cracks in the shutters, but the shadows seemed to cling to him, heavy and thick, as if they were part of his nightmare, lingering even as he woke. He could still hear the whispers, chittering, like the sound of claws scraping against stone, and somewhere in the distance, a voice calling his name, a voice that was both strange and strangely familiar. It had echoed in his dreams all night, whispering words he couldn't understand, words that twisted and writhed in his mind like snakes. Beside him, his younger brother Mark stirred, muttering something in his sleep. Luke felt a pang of worry as he watched him, his face pale even in the dim light. Mark had been having nightmares, too. Everyone in the village was. Luke had overheard his neighbors talking about it just yesterday, their voices hushed and fearful, as if speaking of it would bring the nightmares closer. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, resting his head in his hands as he tried to shake off the lingering unease. The nightmares had started shortly after the sickness appeared, creeping into their minds like a shadow that couldn't be escaped. And every night they grew worse, darker, until Luke could barely tell where the dream ended and reality began. He had seen things in his dreams, dark tunnels twisting beneath the earth, lined with claw marks, with shadows flitting at the edges of his vision, and always that voice calling to him, whispering a name he didn't recognize but couldn't forget. Skrivax. The name sent a chill down his spine, though he didn't know why. It was foreign, wrong, like something that didn't belong here, didn't belong in his mind. But it was there, rooted in his thoughts like a disease, and no matter how he tried, he couldn't shake it. He stood, slipping out of the small cottage as quietly as he could, not wanting to wake Mark or their mother. The air outside was damp and cold, a mist hanging low over the ground, curling around his feet as he walked. The village was silent, but there was an undercurrent of tension, a sense of something lurking just out of sight. He wasn't the only one awake. As he made his way down the narrow dirt path, he saw other villagers standing outside their homes, their faces pale, their eyes hollow with exhaustion and fear. They looked as though they hadn't slept in days, their shoulders hunched, their expressions haunted. They glanced at him as he passed, but no one spoke. There was nothing to say. He made his way to the well in the center of the village, hoping that the cold water might help clear his mind. But as he lowered the bucket, he felt a prickle of unease, a sense that he was being watched. He looked up, his gaze drifting to the line of trees at the edge of the village, where the mist hung thick and still. There, in the shadows, he thought he saw movement, a flash of red eyes, a hunched figure scuttling just out of sight. His heart leapt into his throat, and he blinked. But when he looked again, there was nothing. Just the trees, silent and shrouded in fog. "Luke." The voice was barely more than a whisper, but it sent a shock through him, cold and sharp. He turned, but there was no one there, only the empty square and the silent cottages, their windows dark and unseeing. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. It's just the nightmares, he told himself, though the words felt hollow. Just the sickness. Everyone's on edge. But as he hauled the bucket up from the well, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that there was something lurking in the mist, something that saw him, knew him. He splashed his face with the cold water, hoping it would clear his thoughts, but the sensation only grew stronger, a prickling awareness that set his nerves on edge. He glanced around, scanning the shadows, but there was nothing. Just the fog, thick and suffocating, pressing down on him like a weight. As he made his way back toward the cottage, he noticed something strange. Scratches, faint but distinct, running along the walls of one of the nearby homes. They were deep, ragged, as if something with claws had dragged them across the wood. He paused, tracing one of the marks with his finger, feeling the rough edges where the wood had splintered. What could have made those? He muttered to himself, though he wasn't sure he wanted an answer. He continued down the path, his mind racing with questions, each one more unsettling than the last. The sickness, the nightmares, the strange burrows in the fields, it all felt connected, pieces of a puzzle he couldn't quite see. And then there was that name, the one that lingered in his mind like a poison. Skrivax. The name felt wrong on his tongue, like something dark and oily, something that didn't belong here. He'd never heard it before, but it had been in his dreams, whispering to him, calling him deeper, as if inviting him into the darkness. That evening, as he sat with his family for supper, he noticed Mark's face was even paler than usual, his eyes ringed with shadows. His brother picked at his food, barely eating, his gaze distant. "Mark," Luke said softly, trying to keep his voice steady. "Are you all right?" Mark glanced up, his expression haunted. "I had a bad dream," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "There were things crawling through the dark, and they were watching me." Luke felt a chill run down his spine. "It was just a dream," he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. "Everyone's been having them. It's probably just the sickness. Once it's gone, the dreams will stop." But even as he said it, he could feel the lie in his words, a hollow reassurance that did nothing to quiet the fear twisting in his gut. The sickness wasn't just some ordinary illness, and he knew it. Whatever was causing it, whatever was burrowing beneath their fields, was something far darker, something that lived and breathed in the shadows of Mousillon. That night, the nightmares returned, stronger than before. Luke found himself in a vast, twisting tunnel, the walls lined with claw marks and strange, writhing symbols that seemed to pulse with a sickly green light. The air was thick with the stench of rot, and he could hear the sound of chittering, like the scurrying of countless tiny feet, echoing through the darkness. And then he saw them, figures, hunched and twisted, with eyes that gleamed like embers in the dark. They moved in jerky, unnatural motions, their claws scraping against the stone as they crawled toward him. He tried to run, but his feet felt rooted to the ground, and he could only watch as they came closer, their faces twisted into hideous grins, their voices a low, guttural chant. "Skrivax, Skrivax, Skrivax." The name echoed through the tunnel, filling his mind, drowning out all other thoughts. He felt it wrap around him, tightening like a noose, suffocating him as the figures drew closer, their eyes gleaming with hunger. He woke with a gasp, clutching his chest, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. The room was dark, but he could still hear the echoes of that chant, the sound of claws scratching against stone, the whisper of his name in a voice that didn't belong to any living creature. As he lay there, trying to catch his breath, he felt a terrible certainty settle over him. The sickness, the nightmares, the burrows, they were all connected, all pieces of a darkness that was spreading through Mousillon like a poison. And at the center of it all was Skrivax, a name that filled him with dread, a name that felt like a shadow clinging to his soul. He knew then that he couldn't ignore it any longer. Whatever was happening to Mousillon, whatever darkness lay beneath the fields and the village, He had to find a way to stop it. He didn't know what he was up against, didn't know if he even stood a chance. But he knew one thing: he couldn't let the darkness consume them all. With a final, shuddering breath, he lay back down, his mind filled with visions of tunnels and shadows, of clawed hands reaching up from the depths, and as he drifted into a restless sleep, he whispered the name once more, a faint plea in the darkness. Skrivax. Chapter 4. The Gathering Shadows. The sickness was spreading faster than anyone had anticipated. Every morning more villagers were struck down, their faces pale, eyes hollow, and voices weak as they coughed and gasped for breath. Luke could feel the tension thickening in the air, like the scent of a storm building on the horizon. Fear seeped through Mousillon, casting its shadow over every home, every whispered conversation. And with each passing day, Luke's dread grew. The village healer, an elderly woman named Therese, moved between houses, carrying her worn leather satchel filled with herbs and tonics, but Luke could see the worry etched into her face. The remedy she prepared seemed to offer little relief, as if the sickness were something unnatural, something beyond the reach of any herb or poultice. She told the villagers to rest, to drink, to pray, but none of it was working. Luke watched Therese as she visited his neighbor, old Jean, who had taken ill just yesterday. Jean had been healthy, as hardy as any man his age could be, but now he lay in his bed, his skin pallid, his breath rattling in his chest. Luke stood outside, staring through the window as Therese tended to him, her movements slow and weary. She glanced up, meeting his gaze through the glass, and he saw the fear in her eyes, the same fear that had been growing in him, festering like an open wound. He didn't wait for her to leave. Instead, he approached her as she stepped out of Jean's cottage, her hands wringing her satchel's worn strap, her shoulders slumped. Therese, he called quietly, not wanting to attract the attention of the other villagers. What's happening? Why isn't anyone getting better? She looked at him, her eyes dark and tired, the lines on her face seeming deeper than before. She sighed, her voice barely a whisper. I don't know, Luke. I've never seen anything like this. It's as if the sickness is coming from the very earth itself. Her words sent a chill through him, and he remembered the burrows, the scratches in the soil, the strange green glow he had glimpsed. He had tried to tell himself that it was nothing, that it was just his imagination, but he couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that it was all connected. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. Have you noticed anything unusual, besides the sickness? Therese frowned, glancing around as if she were afraid of being overheard. She leaned in closer, her voice low. I have, actually. Some of the villagers have mentioned hearing strange noises at night, scratching, like something clawing at the ground. And some have seen shadows moving in the fields, shapes that vanish when they try to get a closer look. Luke's heart pounded, his mind racing. The scratches, the shadows, the sickness, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle, pieces he was beginning to see with dreadful clarity. Therese, he whispered, his voice tight. Do you think this sickness is something unnatural? She didn't answer right away, her gaze distant, troubled. Finally she nodded, her voice barely more than a breath. Yes, Luke. I think something dark has come to Mousillon, something beyond our understanding, and I fear it may already be too late to stop it. He swallowed hard, his mouth dry. The words hung heavy between them, a grim acknowledgement of the shadow gathering over the village. He thanked her quietly and turned, making his way back to his family's cottage, his mind churning with questions and half-formed fears. When he arrived home, he found Mark waiting for him, his face pale, his eyes wide with worry. Luke, he said, his voice trembling, did you hear? They found another one, another burrow. It's near the old chapel this time. Luke's stomach twisted. The burrows seemed to be appearing closer and closer to the heart of the village, as if something were tunneling its way toward them, inch by inch. He nodded, his jaw tight. We need to see it. Mark hesitated, glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. Are you sure? What if there's something down there? Luck placed a reassuring hand on his brother's shoulder, though he didn't feel the reassurance himself. "We need to understand what's happening, Mark. If we don't, then—" He trailed off, not needing to finish the thought. They both knew what was at stake. Together, they made their way through the village, keeping to the narrow, winding paths between cottages, hoping to avoid the gaze of the other villagers. They reached the chapel, a small, weathered building standing alone at the edge of the village, its stone walls covered in moss and ivy. Luke remembered attending Mass there as a child, the dim light of candles casting strange shadows over the statues of saints and martyrs. The burrow was at the back, near the roots of an ancient oak tree that loomed over the chapel like a silent guardian. Luke knelt beside the hole, peering into its depths. It was wider than the others, and he could see faint claw marks raked into the soil, as if something was sharp, jagged nails had scraped its way up from below. The stench was overpowering, a sickly, earthy smell that made his stomach churn. But it wasn't just the smell. It was the sense of something alive, something lurking just out of sight, watching him from the shadows. He reached out, running his fingers over the edges of the burrow, feeling the roughness of the claw marks, the faint chill that seeped into his skin. As he did, he thought he heard something, a faint, chittering sound, like the scurrying of small feet, echoing up from the darkness. Mark took a step back, his face pale. "Luke, let's get out of here. I don't like this." Luke nodded, rising to his feet, but his gaze lingered on the burrow, the shadows shifting and writhing as if alive. He felt a strange compulsion, a pull that seemed to draw him closer, as though something deep in the earth were calling to him, whispering his name. He shook himself, forcing the feeling away. "You're right, let's go." As they walked back toward the village, Luke's thoughts churned. The sickness, the burrows, the scratching sounds in the night, it was all connected. He could feel it, a web of darkness spreading beneath their feet, reaching up to claim them. That evening he decided to speak with Father Emile. The priest was a quiet man, stern but fair, his faith unshakable even in the face of Mousillon's many curses. Luke hoped that, if nothing else, Father Emile might offer some guidance, some explanation for the strange events plaguing their village. He found the priest in the chapel, kneeling before the altar, his hands clasped in prayer. Luke hesitated, feeling a pang of guilt for interrupting, but his need for answers outweighed his hesitation. "Father Emile," he called softly, his voice echoing through the silent chapel. The priest turned, his face lined with fatigue, his eyes shadowed with worry. "Luke, what brings you here at this hour?" Luke took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "Father, I am worried. About the sickness, about what's happening to the village. I think it's something unnatural." Father Emile's gaze sharpened, and he rose to his feet, his expression grave. "Go on." Luke told him everything. About the burrows, the claw marks, the strange sounds, and the name that haunted his dreams. As he spoke, he saw a flicker of fear in the priest's eyes, a shadow that deepened with every word. When he finished, Father Emile was silent, his brow furrowed. Finally he spoke, his voice low, almost a whisper. "There are stories, Luke. Old stories, tales of creatures that dwell beneath the earth, creatures that serve dark gods and spread disease and despair. I thought they were just that, stories meant to frighten children. But now," he trailed off, his gaze distant, troubled. Luke's heart pounded. "Father, what do we do?" The priest looked at him, his expression grim. "We pray, Luke, and we stay vigilant. I don't know what darkness has come to Mousillon, but we must be strong. The Lady protects us, even in these cursed lands." Luke nodded, but the words did little to ease his fear. He could see the doubt in Father Emile's eyes, the uncertainty that lingered beneath his words. Whatever was happening to Mousillon, it was beyond the priest's understanding, beyond the power of faith alone. As he left the chapel, Luke glanced back at the ancient oak tree, its gnarled branches twisting into the darkening sky. He could feel the weight of something lurking beneath, something that watched and waited, biding its time. The shadows were gathering, creeping closer with each passing day, and Luke knew that whatever lay beneath Mousillon soil was only growing stronger. The sickness, the nightmares, the burrows, they were all part of a darkness that had taken root in their village, spreading like a poison, an infection that threatened to consume them all. And at the center of it all was the name that haunted his dreams, the name that echoed in his mind like a curse. Skrivax. The word lingered on his tongue as he walked through the village, a whisper in the dark, a promise of something yet to come. Chapter 5. Descent into Darkness. Luke stood at the edge of the newest burrow, his heart pounding as he stared into its depths. The air was thick and foul, filled with the smell of rotten, damp earth, as though the ground itself were decaying beneath their feet. Around him, a small group of villagers had gathered, Mark, of course, and also Armand and Jean, two others who shared his fear of what was creeping up from the ground. Luke's hand trembled as he tightened his grip on the rusted torch he'd brought with him. The flame flickered weakly, casting long shadows that danced along the edges of the burrow. He took a shaky breath, steeling himself. For days he'd felt the dread growing, a dark certainty that whatever was plaguing Mousillon would not stop until they faced it head-on. And so, here he was, standing at the brink of that darkness, ready to descend into the unknown. Luke, Mark's voice was barely more than a whisper, his face pale in the torchlight. "Are you sure about this?" Luke nodded, though he wasn't sure at all. He was terrified, every instinct screaming at him to run, to stay away from whatever waited below. But he couldn't stand by any longer, couldn't watch his family, his friends, his entire village fall to the sickness without doing something. Anything. "We have to understand what's down there," Luke said, his voice steadier than he felt. If we just let it fester, it'll swallow all of us." Armand grunted, his jaw clenched, though Luke saw the fear in his eyes. "I don't like this, Luke. But if you're going, then I'll be damned if I let you go alone." Luke gave him a grateful nod, and, one by one, they climbed down into the burrow, the cold earth pressing in around them as they descended. The narrow passageway was rough and uneven, clearly not made by human hands. The walls were clawed and scratched, and the further they went, the more Luke could feel the oppressive weight of the earth closing in, the darkness growing thicker with every step. The smell grew stronger, too, a nauseating blend of decay and something far worse, a thick, acrid odor that seemed to cling to his skin, filling his lungs with each breath. He could see Jean gagging, pressing a hand over his mouth as they moved deeper, but no one spoke. There was nothing to say. The tunnel twisted and turned, and Luke began to feel as though they were being led, guided down a path that had been carved with purpose. His mind raced with thoughts of the creatures that Father Emil had spoken of, the twisted beings from old tales, creatures that worshiped dark gods and spread sickness like a poison through the earth. Skrivax. The name slipped from his lips, barely audible, a whisper in the darkness. Mark glanced at him, his eyes wide. "What did you say?" Luke shook his head, the name lingering in his mind like a shadow. "Nothing. Just a name I keep hearing in my dreams." They pressed on, the passage growing wider, the walls lined with strange symbols scratched into the dirt and rock. They were crude, twisted shapes that seemed to writhe and pulse in the torchlight, as though they were alive, watching them. Luke felt a chill creep down his spine. These markings weren't random, they were intentional, part of some dark ritual that he couldn't begin to understand. He reached out, tracing one of the symbols with his fingers, feeling the rough grooves in the stone. "What kind of creatures would carve these?" Jean whispered, his voice trembling. "Nothing human," Luke replied, his voice tight. He could feel the weight of the place pressing down on him, a sense of being surrounded, as though they were intruders in a place that had been hidden for centuries. They continued down the tunnel, the air growing colder, the darkness thicker. Luke could hear faint sounds now, scratches, cuttling noises, as if they were being watched. Followed. The torch flickered, casting eerie shadows along the walls, and Luke's heart pounded in his chest, a relentless, insistent beat. Finally, they reached an open cavern, a vast space that seemed to stretch endlessly into the dark. In the center, he saw what looked like an altar, a crude slab of stone stained with dark, dried blood, surrounded by bones and fragments of twisted metal. The stench was overwhelming, a sickly sweet rot that clawed at his throat, and he had to fight the urge to retch. Mark gasped, his eyes fixed on the altar. What is this place? Luke swallowed hard, forcing himself to step closer. The altar was covered in strange markings, similar to the ones they had seen in the tunnel, but larger, more elaborate. The bones around it were arranged in strange patterns, as though part of some dark offering. He felt a deep, instinctual revulsion, a sense that this place was a wound in the earth, something that had festered and grown in the dark, hidden from the light. "We shouldn't be here," Armand muttered, his voice shaking. This is evil." Luke didn't respond. His eyes were drawn to a figure near the back of the cavern, shrouded in shadow. It stood hunched, its back twisted, its eyes glinting in the faint torchlight with a sickly green glow. The figure turned, and Luke felt a surge of terror, a primal fear that gripped him, freezing him in place. The creature was unlike anything he had ever seen, part rat, part man, its fur matted and filthy, its teeth sharp and yellowed. It wore tattered robes stained with dark patches, and in its clawed hand it held a staff, topped with a twisted, black stone that pulsed with a faint, ominous light. Luke's breath caught in his throat. This was no ordinary beast. This was a creature of purpose, of dark intelligence. It was no mere animal. It was something much, much worse. The creature's eyes fixed on him, narrowing, and Luke felt as though it could see into him, see his fear, his thoughts, his very soul. And then it spoke, its voice a guttural hiss, dripping with malice. "Skrivax welcomes you." The name hit him like a blow, the sound of it filling the cavern, echoing off the walls. Luke staggered back, his heart pounding, his mind reeling. This was Skrivax, the creature that had haunted his dreams, the name that had lingered in his mind like a curse. Behind him, Mark let out a strangled gasp, and Jean whispered a prayer, his voice trembling. They were all frozen, caught in the gaze of the creature before them, unable to move, to think, to breathe. Skrivax took a step forward, its eyes glinting with a cruel, mocking light. "You fools," it sneered, its voice dripping with contempt. "You think you can stop us? You think you can cleanse this place? The disease is already within you, within your village. It seeps into the earth, into your flesh, into your souls." Luke felt a surge of anger cutting through his fear. "Why are you doing this? What do you want with us?" Skrivax tilted its head, its lips twisting into a hideous smile. "We want everything. Your land, your lives, your souls. You are nothing but fodder. Pray for the great work that lies ahead." The creature raised its staff, and the stone atop it glowed brighter, casting an eerie green light across the cavern. Luke could feel its power, a dark, pulsing energy that seemed to reach out, wrapping around him, filling him with a cold, numbing dread. "We must leave," Armand hissed, his voice barely more than a breath. "Now." Luke nodded, his eyes still locked on Skrivax. He took a step back, then another, his heart racing as he fought the urge to flee. The creature watched them, its smile widening, as though it were savoring their fear. "Run, little humans," it sneered, its voice echoing through the cavern. "Run while you can. But know this, Mousillon is ours, and soon you will all fall." With a final, fearful glance at the twisted creature, Luke turned and bolted, his heart pounding as he raced back through the tunnel, the others close behind. The air was thick, suffocating, filled with the echo of Skrivax's laughter, a cruel, mocking sound that chased them up through the darkness. They emerged from the burrow, gasping for breath, their faces pale, their eyes wide with terror. Luke could still feel the creature's gaze, its presence lingering in his mind like a shadow, a stain he couldn't wash away. As he looked around at his friends, he knew one thing for certain. The darkness beneath Mousillon was alive, and it was coming for them. The village was already infected, already claimed, and unless they found a way to fight, to resist, they would all fall. The shadows had gathered, and now there was no escape. Chapter 6. The Shadow of Skrivax. Luke couldn't shake the creature's gaze from his mind, even as he sat in the flickering light of his family's small hearth, surrounded by familiar walls and the quiet sounds of his mother and brother preparing supper. He felt it, those sickly green eyes, seeing through him, twisting his thoughts with darkness. Skrivax. The name felt like poison on his tongue, something foul and invasive that refused to leave. It echoed in his mind, haunting him like a curse, reminding him that what he'd seen in the tunnels wasn't just some fevered nightmare. It was real as the sickness spreading through Mousillon, as real as the fear he saw in the eyes of every villager who had learned of their descent into the dark. He clenched his fists, his knuckles white, as he stared into the flames. How could he explain what he'd seen? How could he make them understand that this was no ordinary sickness, no mere curse? Luke. Mark's voice pulled him from his thoughts, and he looked up to see his brother standing in the doorway, his face pale, eyes wide. You're all right, aren't you? Luke managed a weak nod. I'm all right, Mark. But the words felt hollow, and he could see that Mark wasn't convinced. Mark took a step closer, his voice low. Are you sure? Because after what we saw, after what that thing said, he trailed off, shivering. Look, do you think it's true? That Mousillon is already lost? Luke swallowed hard, forcing down the surge of despair that threatened to overwhelm him. He couldn't let himself believe that. Not yet. No, he said firmly. We're not lost. Not if we can figure out what it wants and stop it. Mark gave him a skeptical look, but nodded, his jaw set with determination. Then we have to warn the others. They need to know what's really happening here. The thought of speaking to the villagers, of telling them that Mousillon had been claimed by a twisted creature that lived beneath their feet, made Luke's stomach twist. But he knew Mark was right. The people had to know, even if they wouldn't believe it, even if it only spread more fear. Father Emile might understand, Luke said, a flicker of hope breaking through his fear. If anyone knows what to do, it's him. They left the cottage under the cover of night, the shadows long and heavy as they made their way through the narrow streets toward the chapel. The air was thick with silence, and Luke couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the darkness itself was alive, listening to their every step. When they reached the chapel, they found Father Emile alone, kneeling before the altar, his head bowed in prayer. His face looked drawn, weary, as though the sickness had aged him overnight. Luke felt a pang of guilt for disturbing him, but they couldn't wait any longer. Father Emile, he called softly, his voice echoing in the quiet of the chapel. The priest looked up, his gaze heavy with fatigue and worry. Luke, Mark, he murmured, rising to his feet. What brings you here at this hour? Luke took a deep breath, steadying himself. Father, we went down into one of the tunnels. There's something down there, something unnatural. Father Emile's face tightened, his eyes narrowing. What did you see? Luke glanced at Mark, who nodded, urging him to continue. We saw a creature, he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. It was like a rat, but larger, twisted. It spoke to us, called itself Skrivax. It said, he swallowed, feeling a chill run through him. It said Mousillon belongs to it now, that the sickness is a part of it. The priest's expression darkened, his eyes hardening with a mix of fear and anger. Skrivax, he murmured, his voice trembling slightly. That name, it's an old one. I had heard it only in stories, whispers of creatures that dwell in the dark places, creatures that worship powers far beyond our understanding. Mark shivered beside him. But what does it want with us, Father? Father Emile sighed, running a hand over his face. If it truly is a creature of chaos, then it seeks nothing less than destruction. Chaos thrives on corruption, on disease, on fear. It spreads like a plague, burrowing into the hearts of men, consuming everything in its path. Luke clenched his fists, his anger flaring. So what can we do? How do we fight something like that? The priest shook his head slowly. I don't know, Luck. I've prayed, I've sought guidance, but Mousillon is already cursed. The lady's protection has always been weak here, and if Skrivax has taken root, He trailed off, his gaze distant, filled with a sorrow that seemed to stretch far beyond the present moment. Luke felt his heart sink. If even Father Emile couldn't help them, what chance did they have? But he couldn't let that thought take hold, couldn't let himself give in to the despair that gnawed at him. There has to be a way, he said, his voice hard, determined. If we do nothing, then Skrivax wins. The sickness will keep spreading, and we'll lose everything. The priest looked at him, a faint glimmer of hope flickering in his eyes. Perhaps, he murmured, but fighting chaos is no easy task. It is insidious, creeping, corrupting all it touches. And once it has found a foothold, he sighed, his gaze dropping to the ground. It is almost impossible to uproot. Luke straightened, his jaw set. Then we'll find a way. We have to. Father Emile studied him for a moment, his expression a mixture of admiration and pity. Very well, he said at last. If you are determined, then I will help in any way I can. But be careful, Luke. Skrivax is not a mere beast. It is a creature of darkness, of cunning. It will know you are trying to resist. The warning lingered in Luke's mind as he and Mark left the chapel, stepping into the cold, silent night. The village lay shrouded in darkness, each shadow seeming to stretch out toward them, reaching with unseen claws. What now? Mark asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Luke looked around, his gaze sweeping over the empty streets, the darkened windows, the faint glow of the chapel behind them. We watch, we listen. If Skrivax has spread its influence, then it must be leaving signs. We just have to find them. They spent the next few nights searching the village, keeping to the shadows, their senses sharpened by fear and determination. They found more burrows, each one larger than the last, all leading deeper into the ground, as though something were digging toward the heart of Mousillon. But it was the marks that disturbed Luke the most, the strange, twisted symbols they found carved into the sides of buildings, scratched into the earth around the burrows. They were cruder, yet unmistakable, each one a dark echo of the symbols he had seen in the cavern below. The sight of them sent a chill through him, a reminder that Skrivax's presence was spreading, that the creature's shadow was reaching further into their lives with each passing day. One evening, as they examined a fresh set of claw marks near Terz's cottage, Mark paused, his face pale, his eyes wide. "Luke, do you hear that?" Luke froze, straining to listen. At first he heard only the quiet rustle of the wind, the distant call of an owl. But then, faint and low, he heard it. A chittering sound, like the scrape of claws on stone, growing louder, closer. "Run," he whispered, grabbing Mark's arm. "We have to get out of here." They bolted down the narrow street, their footsteps echoing through the silence, the chittering growing louder. Following them, filling the air with the sound of countless claws, countless voices. They reached the edge of the village, ducking behind a stone wall, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Luke peered over the edge, his heart pounding as he scanned the shadows, waiting, listening. For a moment, there was only silence, and he began to think that they had escaped. But then he saw it, a figure moving through the darkness, hunched and twisted, its eyes glowing with that sickly green light, searching, hunting. It stopped, sniffing the air, its gaze sweeping over the street. Luke held his breath, his heart racing as he watched it, praying that it wouldn't see them. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and slunk back into the shadows, disappearing into the night. Luke let out a shaky breath, his hands trembling. "Skrivax, it's spreading. It's not just below us anymore. It's here in the village." Mark looked at him, fear shining in his eyes. "What do we do now?" Luke swallowed, his mind racing. They couldn't fight it, couldn't face it head-on. But perhaps they didn't have to. Father Emile had said that chaos thrived on fear, on corruption. If they could weaken Skrivax's influence, perhaps they could drive it back, break its hold on Mousillon. "We find the others," he said, his voice steady, resolute. "We warn them. And we don't let Skrivax win." They slipped back into the village, moving through the shadows, their fear tempered by a fierce, unyielding determination. The shadow of Skrivax loomed over them, dark and insidious, but Luck knew one thing for certain: they would not surrender. Not while there was still a chance to save their home, to drive the darkness back into the depths from which it had come. Chapter 7. Into the Skaven Lair. Luke crouched at the entrance of the burrow, his heart pounding as he peered into the darkness stretching out beneath him. The narrow tunnel yawned open like a wound in the earth, a gateway to the very heart of the curse that had gripped Mousillon. The air was thick with the smell of rotten, damp earth, the sickly scent that had begun to haunt him every waking moment. Behind him, Mark, Armand, and a few other villagers huddled close, their faces tense, eyes flickering with fear and determination. "Are we really doing this?" Mark whispered, his voice trembling. What if we don't make it back?" Luke felt the weight of his brother's question, the doubt that lingered in every heart here. But they had come too far to turn back now. Too many lives had already been lost to this shadow that slithered under Mousillon, and Luke knew they couldn't live like this, waiting for it to consume them all. "We've got no choice," he replied, his voice firmer than he felt. "If we don't end this, no one else will." With that, he lowered himself into the tunnel, his feet sinking into the cold, wet earth. The others followed in silence, their breaths ragged as they descended, one by one, into the darkness. Luck led the way, his torch casting long shadows along the twisted walls, illuminating the claw marks that scarred the passage, each one a testament to the dark, unnatural creatures that lurked within. They reached a bend in the tunnel, and Luke held up his hand, signaling for the others to stop. He could hear faint sounds ahead, chittering, scuttling, like the sound of claws scraping against stone. His heart hammered in his chest, but he forced himself to keep moving, his grip tight on the torch as he rounded the corner. The tunnel opened up into a cavern, vast and shadowy, its walls lined with strange, twisted structures that looked like nests or hives, made from mud and scraps of metal. The floor was littered with bones, some animal, some disturbingly human, scattered around the edges of the room, their hollow eyes seeming to watch the intruders. At the center of the cavern stood an altar, crude and blood-stained, made of jagged stone, and adorned with twisted symbols that pulsed with a faint, sickly green glow. And there, looming over it, was a figure draped in tattered robes, its hunched form moving with a jerky, unnatural rhythm as it muttered in a strange, guttural language. Luke's blood ran cold as he recognized the creature. It was Skrivax, the twisted Skaven that had haunted his nightmares. Its beady, red eyes gleamed with a cruel intelligence, a dark satisfaction as it turned its gaze toward them, as though it had been expecting them all along. "Aha, little human," Skrivax hissed, its voice a wet, rasping sound that sent a chill through Luke's bones. "You come to Skrivax's lair, to die, yes, yes." The villagers froze, their breaths shallow, but Luke forced himself to step forward, keeping his voice steady. "We're here to end this," he said, his words ringing hollow against the oppressive silence of the cavern. "Whatever you're doing to Mousillon, it stops now." Skrivax tilted its head, a twisted smile spreading across its face. "And? Stop? Foolish man thing. Mousillon belongs to Skaven, belongs to Skrivax. Your village, your lives, all will feed the horned rat." Luke clenched his fists, anger rising to meet his fear. "You can't have our village. We won't let you." Skrivax let out a high-pitched, mocking laugh, its sharp teeth glinting in the faint green light. "You think you can fight me? You, with your torches, your little, useless weapons?" It took a step forward, its claws scraping against the stone, the shadows twisting around it as though obeying its will. But Luke didn't back down. He knew this creature thrived on fear, on despair, and he refused to give it that satisfaction. He looked back at the others, seeing the terror in their eyes, but also the spark of defiance, the determination that had brought them here. "Mark, Armand," he whispered, his voice low, spread out. "Look for anything we can use. If we destroy that altar, maybe we can weaken it." Mark nodded, his face pale but resolute, and the villagers moved into the cavern, their eyes darting between Skrivax and the twisted structures that lined the walls. Luke focused on the altar, the way it seemed to pulse with dark energy, as though it were alive, feeding on the sickness that had spread through Mousillon. As he reached out, Skrivax let out a shriek, lunging forward, its claws flashing in the dim light. Luke barely had time to dodge, stumbling back as the creature's claws sliced through the air, missing him by inches. "Destroy it," he shouted to the others, his voice echoing through the cavern. "Whatever it takes, break the altar." Armand grabbed a nearby rock, hurling it at the altar with all his strength. The stone struck the symbols, sending a crack spidering across the surface. But the dark energy only pulsed brighter, flaring with a sickly green light. Skrivax screeched, its eyes blazing with fury. "No, you cannot. This is Skrivax's work, Skrivax's power." Luck took advantage of the creature's distraction, lunging forward with his torch, thrusting it toward the altar. The flame flickered, catching on the dried blood and strange symbols, and with a hiss, the fire took hold, casting the altar in an eerie glow. The green light flickered, dimming as the fire spread, and Skrivax let out a howl of rage. Realizing that he was losing his grip on the altar's power, he let out a final, shrieking threat. "This is not over. Skrivax will return. Yes, yes. You cannot stop what festers beneath your feet." With a furious snarl, Skrivax leapt into the shadows, his form slipping into a narrow tunnel on the far side of the cavern. His hasty retreat echoed through the tunnels as he vanished, his chittering laughter fading into the distance. The villagers, panting and exhausted, watched the flickering shadows, bracing for another attack. But as the altar crumbled, its green light fading, an oppressive darkness lifted, leaving only silence. Luke staggered back, breathing heavily, his eyes on the spot where Skrivax had disappeared. "For now, we've driven him away." Mark stepped forward, his face pale but triumphant. Did we do it? Is it over?" Luke nodded, though he knew the threat wasn't truly gone. "We weakened him. Mousillon is free, for now." As they made their way back through the tunnel, the weight that had pressed down on Luke for so long began to lift, replaced by a quiet, steady hope. They had faced the darkness and won. They had banished the shadow of Skrivax, broken the curse that had plagued them, and reclaimed their village. But even as they stepped into the cool night air, Luke knew the creature's parting words would haunt him. Somewhere in the shadows, Skrivax lurked, waiting for his chance to return.